Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Kelly Weiner, and I'm a partner at Scott Legal PC. And today we're going to spend some time talking about the E-2 visa requirements and renewal considerations. So, a few housekeeping items before we get started. Some of you may know this firm was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the US on an E-2 visa and has been on several different visas, including an F1, TN, B, and H1B. Our firm is a full service immigration law firm, and we offer immigration services in a number of different areas, including E2, E1, TN, L1, family immigration, national interest waivers, EB5, extraordinary ability visas, and more. We have processed hundreds of E2 visas, and we typically process E2 visas that are higher risk, meaning lower investment amounts. We've processed at consulates around the world, but primarily we process in Toronto and London. At the end of this webinar, we'll send out a few useful tools. One will be the PowerPoint presentation that we'll go through today, also a link to where you can download guides that go through the visa options in more detail, a link to where you can sign up for additional webinars, and the webinar will be recorded and made available on YouTube, and we will send you the link for that as well. We encourage you to hit subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly upload immigration videos on a wide variety of topics. Today, I will be presenting. As I mentioned, my name is Kelly Weiner, and I'm a partner at Scott Legal and have many years of experience processing E-2 visas. For any questions, please add them to the chat box or the Q&A, and we will get to questions towards the end of the presentation. So without further delay, let's get started. All right, what are the E-2 visa requirements? So the E-2 visa is a great visa for entrepreneurs. You must be a national of a treaty country, which means you must hold a passport for a treaty country. And there are over 80 E2 countries. Countries are added and some are also dropped from the list. So important to kind of keep checking that to make sure that even if there was an E2 visa available, for example, for Bolivian nationals, E2 visas used to be available, but no longer in the same way. And then countries are also added. So, for example, New Zealand was added a few years ago. So the E2 company has to be at least 50% owned by nationals of the treaty country, and they must be coming to the US to develop and direct the business. So it's not a visa that allows you to kind of be completely passive or a passive owner. You do have to take a role in developing and directing the business. You have to make a substantial investment. And so what is substantial, we're going to discuss in more detail later in the presentation. But there is no kind of $1 figure the way there is for other, categories such as the EB5. You must put your funds at risk and irrevocably commit your funds. So this means that you actually have to spend money. It's not sufficient to kind of take money and put it into a business bank account and say it will be spent over time. It actually does have to be spent. Or if you're purchasing a business, sometimes it can be placed into escrow. So in terms of how much investment is enough, we'll talk about this later in the presentation, but generally you want to keep in mind what type of business are you starting and what are reasonable startup costs for that type of business. You also have to prove that the investment funds come from a legitimate source, so not from any kind of criminal activity. Generally, you're going to prove this by showing documents related to the source of funds. So, for example, if you sold a property, you would provide kind of the purchase sale agreement for that property, proof of you receiving the funds, maybe paying taxes on those funds. So the documents you'll provide will, depend on the type of the source of funds. The business also has to be real and operating. So if you are purchasing an existing business, this means you're going to look for things like tax returns, invoices, active insurance, licenses, anything that shows the business is actually operating. And if you are going the startup route, you're going to want to show that kind of the business is at the point where it could start to operate as soon as the visa is granted. So these would be things like showing you've obtained a tax ID, you've incorporated the company, you've set up a business bank account, you've gotten a commercial lease agreement in place, you've purchased equipment, all the licenses are in place, and everything is there. And once you get that visa, you'll be able to start operating the company. There's also a requirement called the marginality requirement, which means that the business must support more than just the investor and their family. And the way this really translates is you need to show that you're going to hire workers in the United States to work at the business, or if you're purchasing an existing business that already has employees, you're going to continue, employing those workers, or maybe even hire additional workers. The E-2 also requires a showing of non-immigrant intent. You have to have the intent to return to your home country if and when the E-2 status ends. That being said, E-2s can be renewed indefinitely. And the standard for approving non-immigrant intent is a bit lower than some other visa types. So, for example, for an F1 or a TN, you have to show you have a residence abroad that you do not intend to abandon. For the E2, it's generally sufficient to explain that you intend to depart if or when the E2 status ends, but you are permitted to kind of move your residence to the United States and kind of live in the United States. All right, let's talk about some options and timing for obtaining an E2 visa. So there are kind of two options. One is starting a brand new business in the United States. So this is going to sometimes be a bit more involved. You need to incorporate a company. Kind of you need to do everything from scratch, get that business bank account, fund the company, get everything you need to get the company up and running. Another option might be purchasing an existing business in the US. So this is where you're going to kind of sign a purchase sale agreement. And then there's two options there. One is you can go through with the sale before the visa is granted. This is a bit of a riskier option because then if the visa isn't granted, you're kind of left with the business and may need to hire someone to run it for you in the US. But there is an option with purchasing a business to kind of protect yourself a bit more, and this is through an escrow agreement. So for the E2, when you're purchasing a business, what you can do is you can sign a purchase sale agreement and say all conditions of the sale are satisfied except for the grant of the E2 visa. And rather than the money going directly to the seller, the money will go to an escrow agent, and the escrow agent will hold those funds and will confirm that there is no condition on the sale except for the grant of the E2 visa. The escrow instructions can say if the E2 visa is granted, then the money will go to the seller. However, if the E2 visa is denied, the money will go back to the buyer. So this can be an attractive option. In terms of protecting yourself a bit more, so that you're not having to kind of spend that money before you get the visa. You don't really have that option with a startup. With a startup, you really do have to kind of spend the funds, before you can apply for the visa. So how long is your E2 visa valid for? So this will depend. It's not kind of uniform across the board for everyone. This will depend on something called the reciprocity schedule. So, for example, if you are a UK national, you can be granted an E2 visa for up to 5 years, versus if you are an Egyptian national, you can only be granted a visa for I believe 3 months, or from Bangladesh, 3 months. So this means that when you enter the United States, you'll still be given 2 years in E2 status, but that 3-month visa is going to expire, so you can't easily travel in and out of the United States. The consular officer may also kind of play in here in terms of how long your visa is granted for. So, for example, in the UK, although your visa can be granted for 5 years, if an officer decided, well, we think this business is borderline, we're concerned, they may choose to grant the visa for less time. So maybe they would grant the visa for 2 years or 3 years. So they don't have discretion to grant the visa for longer than mandated by the reciprocity schedule, but they can grant it for less time if they choose. For the visa is really your entry document. That's what you're going to use to get into the United States. Once you're in the United States, you're going to be issued an I-94. This is your status document. So this is what proves you're in the United States legally. So even if you have a 5-year visa, when you enter the US, your I-94 will only be issued for 2 years from the date of entry. And it could also be less time if your passport expires earlier than 2 years. So you always want to check your I-94 every time you enter the US. However, similarly, if you have a 3-month visa, you still can be granted 2 years in E2 status. But once you leave the US after that visa is expired, you'll have to go apply for a new visa. For someone with a 5-year visa, what you have to keep in mind is even though you have that 5 years of validity, you can't enter the US and just stay for 5 years and never leave. You would have to leave periodically to kind of reset that 2-year entry, whenever it's about to expire. And it would be very important to do that to avoid accruing any unlawful presence. All right, let's talk about how much investment is enough. Now, this is a very common question, something on everyone's mind. How much do I have to invest? And there is no minimum set investment amount. So for a green card category like the EB-5, there are actual minimums you have to meet, and that's not the case for the E-2, which makes it, more flexible. But you must invest a substantial amount of money. And this is going to depend on what type of business you're starting, also where you apply, the type of examiner you get, and the overall strength of your case. So what the government looks at is a proportionality test. So what they'll say is, if the startup costs for a service-based business are arguably $100,000, and this is a lower investment amount, we want you to spend a high percentage of that startup cost. So ideally 100% of the startup cost for that service-based business. If you have a business with huge fixed startup costs, a business that's going a huge manufacturing plant, something that's going to take, millions and millions of dollars, you can invest a lower percentage of the total. So if the total investment amount would be $100 million, but you've only invested 10 million, even though percentage-wise that's not very much of the total startup cost, because of the magnitude of the investment, it's still going to be considered substantial. The vast majority of people are going to be investing obviously much, much less than that, much less than 10 million, and generally are going to want to be able to argue that you've invested 100% of the costs to set up your type of business. If you're purchasing a business, then generally what you want to show is that you have paid the fair market value, the purchase price for that business. If this is an arm's length transaction, there's no family relationship, you found this business on the open market, the purchase price makes sense in light of the financials, then generally, if you pay the full purchase price, this is going to be considered substantial. You do want to watch out for things like seller financing. That can often be problematic for an E2 because, as we'll talk about a bit later, for the source of funds, you cannot take a loan that uses the assets of the E2 business as security, as collateral. So, for example, if you wanted to purchase a business and you wanted 50% that you were purchasing with your own money and 50% seller financing, this could weaken your case significantly. They may say you have not invested a substantial amount because that 50% seller financing, doesn't count towards the investment because it is secured by the assets of the E2 business and you haven't actually put your own personal funds at risk. So franchises can be a good option for E2 visas. This can be something where you're purchasing an existing business and taking over a franchise agreement. You also can start up a new business, and sign a franchise agreement. And those are, kind of good ways to show that there is a proven business model, for what you're doing. So this may be especially helpful if you're kind of a newer entrepreneur and haven't ever run a successful company before. That structure can be helpful and also look good to the officer. Um, Also important to think about, what are you spending your money on? When we say kind of good and bad E2 expenditures, what we mean is that there are certain expenditures that are going to be viewed as kind of stronger, and ones that are weaker. So, for example, they really don't like to see a lot of investment on travel or hotels or cars, for business development meetings. You want to think strategically about, spending on things like, computers, software, insurance, commercial office space, equipment, maybe hiring some employees and any ancillary expenses related to that. So those are kind of strong expenditures as opposed to kind of the ones like travel. Similarly, like for, some people will ask, well, I'm going to have a home office. Can I use my mortgage payment for my residence? Things like that generally are not going to be strong, for the E2, and we don't recommend including them because it ultimately will weaken the case when the officer looks at that list of expenditures and says, oh, you put your dining table on here because you're going to work at your dining table. They're not really receptive to that. All right. Do I have to hire employees in the US? The answer is yes. The business must have the either present or future capacity to generate enough income to provide more than a minimal living for the E2 investor and their family. And how this translates is they want to show that you are hiring workers in the US. You're not coming in, for example, to be a solo consultant. You're coming in to run a consulting company that is going to employ workers. So you must demonstrate you're going to hire workers for a startup. You show this in a business plan showing hiring over the next 5 years. We generally recommend a business plan showing you're going to hire at least 3 to 5 full-time workers within that 5-year period, generally spread over time. We don't recommend, for example, having 4 years of no employees and hiring them all in year 5. You want to think strategically about how do I show the business is going to grow and hire workers over time. People will also ask, is there a benefit to having a direct W-2 employee as opposed to a contractor, which would be paid on a 1099? And generally, yeah, it is better to have a W-2 employee. If you're in an industry where it's very common to use, subcontractors, for example, the construction industry, and let's say you have a couple employees, but you're primarily paying, large amounts to contractors, this could be okay if the amount is large enough. So, for example, we had a client who was spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars on subcontractors. So there's a strong ability to make an argument there that, this is having a good economic impact in the United States, and that these subcontractors are employing workers. But even in that scenario, it would be beneficial to have at least one or two employees directly working, for the E-2 company. So it's risky to rely only on 1099 workers. Officers generally will want to see some W-2s, some proof of hiring direct employees of the company. So the way that you prove this is, if it's a startup, you're going to show a business plan, with a detailed hiring plan. You can have letters of intent, showing that you're going to hire people, that you have, work lined up that will allow you to hire people. For existing businesses, they often want to see, W-2s, pay stubs, tax returns showing salaries and wages paid. If you're looking to purchase a business for the E-2, you do want to look at the history and see, has this business been able to hire workers? And if it's been in business a long time and never been able to hire workers, that's really not a strong business to buy for the E-2. If you're doing that, you really would need to have kind of a business plan along with it, showing how you're going to increase hiring and change the opportunity. They're not always receptive to businesses, like very, very small businesses that maybe have only ever hired one person. These are generally not strong businesses when you're looking, what to buy for an E-2. All right, let's talk about business plan considerations. Business plans are very important for E-2 startup applications, and they should contain specific things, geared towards proving you meet the E-2 requirements. So one is an executive summary, very briefly, who are you? What do you do? What does your company sell? Market analysis and research, so who are you going to sell to? Why is this a good market to get into? Your marketing plan, what is it that you specifically intend to do? So most businesses are going to need a website. Are you going to have some type of, public relations company you hire? And it should make sense in light of the type of business that you have. Maybe you're going to attend a lot of trade shows. So you want to really think about that and build that into your business plan. A personnel plan is also very important. So we just talked about this, proving that you meet that marginality requirement. You're going to be able to hire workers, and you want to have 5 years of hiring projections showing job titles, planned raises, job descriptions, so that they really understand what are these people going to do for the business, and is this a realistic hiring plan, right? So thinking about, if you're hiring for a high level job, but your financial plan only shows you're going to pay minimum wage, that's not going to be viewed as realistic. You want to think about the market. You also have to include a comprehensive financial plan. So 5 years of financial projections, income statement or profit and loss, balance sheet, cash flow statement. And again, you want to be thinking strategically on, how to explain this so that it makes sense to the officer. They're often going to be skimming the business plan, kind of maybe not, reading it in a ton of detail. So you want there to be kind of common sense explanations that they can get through quickly, to show that, this plan makes sense. It's not kind of either too low as to be marginal, and not kind of so high that it seems, unreasonable. Yeah. All right, let's talk about some E-2 visa considerations. So people will often ask, can I apply with USCIS or should I apply through a consulate? And some important considerations here. So when you apply with USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, you are applying for a change of status. And what that means is you can only apply for this if you're already physically in the U.S. in a status that allows you to change status. So for example, let's say, you entered on ESTA just to do some preliminary business meetings and check out your office space. And now you're wondering, can I do a change of status? The answer is no, you cannot change status from ESTA. However, let's say somebody entered on a B1 visa, and they were here and then their plans changed. They decided they wanted to change status. This could be possible for them. When you apply with a change of status with USCIS, You will only get an approval for 2 years. That's the maximum it can be granted for. And it's not a visa that allows for international travel. So you can kind of get the approval for 2 years, but let's say in year one there was some family emergency and you had to leave the US. You cannot come back on the basis of that approval. You would have to submit a brand new application to a US consulate, generally in your home country or wherever you were. And they would have to approve you and issue you a visa before you could come back. They also do not have to rely on the approval from USCIS. So there are some visa types where first you get an approval with USCIS, and then when you go to the consulate, they're not really adjudicating the case. They're just kind of checking for admissibility issues and kind of approving based on that. That is not the case for the E-2. The E-2 is a different visa in that way, and what it means is once you leave, that approval is not going to, it certainly could be considered as a positive factor, but it's not going to be definitive, and the consulate is going to make their own decision. And often they can have kind of different standards, and we'll talk a little bit about that now. When you apply with USCIS, they take a very strict view of the source and trail of funds. Let's say you're using your personal savings from employment earned over, many years. They're not going to be okay with just a couple of years of tax returns and maybe a bank statement showing a transfer. That could work for a consulate, but for USCIS, they're actually going to want to see those tax returns, your pay stubs, the money arriving in your bank account and being maintained there. Or if it was transferred to multiple bank accounts, you'll need to track those transfers. So it can get quite complicated if you have kind of a certain types of source of funds. Like let's say you're getting 5 gifts from friends. You're going to have to document each of those gifts and show where that person got the money. So before you would go that route, you would want to make sure they were comfortable sharing their financial information. So if you have a very complex source of funds, USCIS may not be a good option. One benefit to USCIS is that they are more receptive to lower investment amounts if it makes sense for the type of business. If you have a service-based business that arguably could be started with a very low startup, maybe even investment as low as 30,000 might work with USCIS. Consulates really will not accept that an investment that low. So, if you have a very clear source of funds and a very low investment with a service-based business and you can enter the US on a B visa, or you're already here, sometimes USCIS can be a good option. Let's talk a little bit about the consulate. So the benefit of a consulate is you're going to actually get a visa stamp that allows you to travel. So for many countries, that means you're going to get a multi-year, multi-entry visa. There are some countries like Bangladesh where it's only 3 months. So it really does depend. But consulates are often a better option just because of that ability to travel, get 2 years each time you come in, and then you have a longer runway to kind of make the business successful before you have to renew. Consulates will also often take a more high-level view of the source and trail of funds. So, the example I gave of personal savings, you could probably submit for many consulates, a few years of tax returns, and then proof of kind of a lump sum transfer, to the E-2 business bank account to make those, E-2 expenditures. However, consulates often will have higher expectations when it comes to investment. So an investment of $30,000, even for a service-based business, would be very difficult at most consulates, even ones like Toronto that are very friendly to kind of smaller business owners. Uh, However, there are, each consulate kind of is different. There are some consulates that are used to seeing kind of multi-million-dollar companies that are sending over a lot of E-2 employees. Those can be less receptive to kind of small business owners and people investing 60,000, 70,000. And then there's some consulates where they see that very frequently and they're more friendly to it. So you do want to discuss that with your attorney and see what your options are for where to apply. So source and trail of funds, we really covered that. As I said, if you are, doing a USCIS filing, you need to make sure you can document exactly where you got the money. If you're getting a gift, the person giving you that money needs to document exactly where they've gotten the money. If you're kind of at the start of your process and you haven't hired a lawyer yet, it's a good idea to hire an immigration lawyer before you transfer any money, just to make sure that that trail is really clear. So loans secured by company assets, I mentioned this previously. You cannot use a loan that is secured by the E-2 company. You can use a loan that is secured by your personal assets. So let's say you want to take out a second mortgage on a home you own, a home equity loan. You want to take out an unsecured loan on your personal signature. All of those things, can work. What the only thing that cannot work with a loan is it cannot be a loan secured by the E2 company assets. Gifts are also permitted, but as I mentioned, the gift giver has to not only provide that gift letter, but also be comfortable sharing their financial documentation to show where they earned that money. So that would be things like their tax returns, if they sold a property, the proof of the sale, if they're getting it from an investment account, statements from their account. So you want to make sure that that is clear to them before they transfer you the money. All right. So for considerations for small investment amounts, when you are going into a consulate with a small investment amount, really saying like anything under 150,000, and really, really low would be under 100,000. You want to make sure that every other aspect of the case is as strong as possible. So for example, if you are starting up a consulting company, there's lots and lots of consultants. So having some letters of intent from people that are interested in hiring you or paying for your services can be very compelling in those types of cases. It can also be helpful. Let's say you have a CPA. Or no one that kind of works with similar types of businesses in your industry, it can be a good idea to have that CPA review your investment schedule, review your business plan, and write a letter with their opinion about the reasonableness of the investment, compared to startup costs for this type of business. Sometimes that can be helpful as well. Um, People will sometimes ask, can you get E2 visas for two investors? And the answer is yes, as long as there is a 50-50 split between the investors. So each one needs to own 50% in order to be considered an E2 investor. If the investors, let's say it's not possible to do a 50-50 split for some reason and they have the same nationality, you could potentially consider an E2 investor and E2 employee case. If they don't have the same nationality, then that's not going to work. You would need to be 50-50 if there's two different nationalities. Substantive changes to the business after filing. So this is an important one. Sometimes people will get the E2 visa, stamp, and then think, okay, I'm authorized to work in the US. And you have to remember, you're authorized to work in the US for the business that was presented to the consulate or to US Citizenship and Immigration Services. If there is a substantial change to that business, you need to get an approval before you can start with that change. So let's say that you're running a wedding photography business, and now you want to close it down and start a restaurant. You cannot do that, without going back to the consulate or going back to USCIS and getting an approval first. However, if there's kind of a natural outgrowth of your business, like you were offering, wedding photography services in Florida, and now you want to expand that and also offer them in New York, nothing wrong with that. That's clearly just kind of the business growing. Also, you can consider in your business plan, let's say, for example, you want to do mobile app development, but it's going to take years to really, bring in any money. So in the interim, your business is focused on software consulting services. That's fine. And if you build into the business plan that mobile app development is going to be part of the business and maybe become more active in years 3 and 4, that prevents you from having to go back. So you do want to kind of think and plan in the future, when you're putting your application together to see if you can kind of contemplate those different types of businesses to avoid having to kind of go back and get approval at a later time. So higher risk cases, there are some areas that make for higher risk in E2. So for one is real estate. This is partially because sometimes there's a misconception that you could kind of purchase a property, put it in the name of an LLC, and that's sufficient. It's a big investment. So that does not meet the requirement to be real and operating. You need to show that this is actually an active running enterprise and not just kind of a passive investment, for example, where you've purchased a property or two and you're collecting, rent. Like that's not going to work for an E2. Similarly, equity trading, kind of similar concerns to real estate in the sense that they're worried, are you just trading for friends and family or personally for yourself? Is this really going to be an active enterprise? Also, there's lots of licenses required. So do you have those licenses? Have you researched in the state that you're working in? Do you have all the proper, certifications or licensing that's needed? Um, Also, if you're purchasing a business from a family member, this can be a high risk case. They may be concerned, the business is worth a lot, but you're giving your, cousin a break and letting them purchase 50% for a very low amount, and that may not be considered substantial. So you do want to make sure that the amount that you're purchasing it for makes sense in light of the company's financials. And it can be a very good idea to get some type of objective valuation from an independent third party who can explain, yes, this actually was a substantial investment, based on the company's financials. This makes sense. This was the fair market value. All right, let's talk about some common reasons for E2 denials. So one would be low investment amount. And we do have another presentation that kind of goes over very specific strategies for how to deal with low investment amounts. That being said, there are some investments that are just too low. We had a client come to us who had spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. They went on their own and were denied. We were able to work with them and kind of get their investment closer to 50,000 spent, 50,000 in the business bank account, and ultimately they were approved. So you do have to consider it is an investor visa, even if it's the type of business where you don't have to spend much because, it just doesn't require a lot. You need to think about maybe what are some expenses I would have over the next couple years because you do need to spend arguably a substantial amount to get the visa granted. So nature of the business can be another reason. We just spoke about this. There are certain categories that are going to have, extra scrutiny on them. And if you're in that category, you want to make sure you have done the extra work to, assure them, yes, this is going to be a real and operating business. Yes, I have all the proper licenses I need, and this will be able to hire workers in the US and, make substantial revenue. Filing location and venue are also important. There are some consulates that are very experienced with E2s and do, many, many of them every month. There are some that do very few. There's also, as I mentioned, consulates that are used to seeing multinational companies and are used to seeing investments of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. They may not be receptive to somebody investing $60,000 to start, a law firm or a consulting company. So if you do have options, it is good to discuss with your attorney to see, what might be the best location, or if, you're stuck in a location where it's not very favorable, at least to go into it understanding what the risks are. Other concern would be, this is kind of related to marginality. So if you've had a business in your home country for many years and you've never hired anyone, they may look at this as a red flag to say, yes, we have your business plan, but can we be assured you're really going to hire anyone? So if they are concerned over whether you're going to create jobs for US workers, this can be a basis for denial. Sometimes, to combat that, maybe you might hire somebody before you file the petition. Not required, but it could strengthen your case, especially if you have a history of never hiring anyone. You may also have issues with the adjudicating officer. So consular officers, they're human beings. They have different levels of skill and training. There are sometimes different, even though the law is the same, some of the standards that consulates will go by are different. So if you do feel like you're having issues with the officer, you want to be as polite as possible because they do have full discretion over whether to grant or deny the visa. And then if you feel there were issues or the law was applied incorrectly, there may be things you can do to try to escalate to a supervisor. But in the moment, you do want to be, as polite as you can, even if the officer is not. And if you do decide to reapply, most consulates will try to give you a different officer. It's not something they guarantee, but they often will try to do that. Another reason for a denial might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. Let's say that you purchased a business and the entire thing was seller financing and you paid a deposit of $5,000. That structure is generally not going to work. Or you as the treaty country national have a US citizen business partner and they own 70% and you own 30% and don't control the company. That's not going to work. So in that case, you'd have to remedy, what the issue was if you were able to, and then refile showing that you do actually meet the requirements. Let's talk about E-2 visa renewals and what it takes to renew an E-2 visa. So one is hiring US workers. This is really key. Many consulates, especially ones that process E-2 visas a lot, will have a streamlined process for renewal. And what they want to see are tax returns, proof you own the company, and proof you've hired US workers. So W-2s, payroll summary, sometimes you can include 1099s, but you really want to show that you've, hired US workers. Let's say that, over the years, maybe you had, 5 employees at, the height, and then Many people had this happen during COVID. Maybe they had to fire people or let people go and they had two employees. So you really want to think about what is the narrative of the company. Can you show that you've really made good faith efforts to hire people over the years? So even if you only have two employees when you apply, maybe you've hired eight people over the years and paid out, a good amount of salaries. You want to flag that in your renewal. You also have to provide updated financial data. So many consulates ask for tax returns for 2 years. Some consulates will ask for tax returns for every year since you filed. So let's say you had a 5-year visa, you're going to be submitting 5 years of tax returns. Um, they're going to want to know, is the company profitable? Like has the company been paying wages? Revenues don't necessarily need to be constantly climbing, but ideally they should be steady. Or if there's dips, that there's a proof that it's kind of gone back up, or that the company has plans for how to turn things around with the business. If your company is really not doing well, you might include kind of a shorter version of the business plan, showing how you're going to turn things around, highlighting any wins, highlighting any, kind of contracts or letters of intent, or anything kind of good on the horizon for the company to show that it does meet the E-2 requirements. Um, in the renewal, it's also important to specify and show the company still meets the E-2 requirements when it comes to things like ownership and the type of the business. So let's say you're in a situation where you are, kind of selling off parts of your business and selling some equity. If you go under 50% ownership of the business, that can be problematic for meeting those E-2 requirements. So you want to kind of think about that before any ownership changes are made. You want to talk with your immigration attorney to understand, will this, create a situation where I'm no longer maintaining my E-2 status because I don't have the proper ownership of the company. Again, changes to the type of business. So if this can be described as kind of a natural outgrowth, like you had a marketing consultancy focused on finance clients, but then you ended up getting into the art world and now you have a bunch of, artistic clients, that's really fine. You're still doing marketing consultancy services just for a different section, of customers. But if the business has really changed and there was no attempt to kind of go back and change it, with the consulate or get an approval, and there was nothing in the business plan indicating this major change, that could be very problematic for a renewal and could lead to denial, or even indications that maybe you violated your status if you shut down the initial business and started the new one without first getting an approval. All right, so developments and adjudication trends and considerations related to the E-2. So E-2 visas generally do have high approval rates, 80 to 90% as posted by the US government. And that has not really changed, over the last several years, even through kind of administrations that have been generally less friendly towards immigration. Approval rates have stayed relatively consistent for the E-2. We do kind of expect to see some changes, and we did see this, in the prior administration. So one is a focus on kind of investment purchases in the US. So it's not a requirement that the funds be invested in the US, but on the kind of thought process that the E-2 is meant to facilitate kind of economic, like benefits between the two treaty countries, you do want to think about making those purchases in the US. And this is something consular officers will sometimes ask about. I'm also just generally across the board wanting to see higher investment amounts. That's just kind of always going to strengthen your case, assuming that you're spending that money on, strong E-2 expenditures. Kind of what doesn't help necessarily is, let's say you've spent $45,000 and you want to just put 200,000 in a business bank account. Having a huge amount of cash in relation to the actual amount spent is often kind of negative for the application. So if you're going to add that additional cash in, you want to make sure that you're looking to spend it on things to actually increase your investment amount, in terms of what you have put at risk. Hiring of U.S. citizens. So, kind of the executive order Buy American, Hire American was kind of, under the Trump administration, kind of the first time around. And this time we have, something that's a bit different, but similar idea of, wanting to kind of hire workers in the U.S., prioritize that, and kind of just providing kind of more scrutiny on visa applications generally, which shows that you would want to have a stronger application. Also a focus on employees as opposed to contractors. So this has kind of always been the case, but even more so now, just wanting to make that argument that you've hired US workers. When you submit your application, to the consulates, there's a form you fill out that will indicate, are the workers US citizens and green card holders? Are they third country nationals? So they do look at that, in terms of hiring. Administrative processing. So there is an executive order that came out earlier this year indicating that for any visa application, there should be extreme vetting. So what this means is that we are seeing more cases go into administrative processing. This is where, after the visa interview, it may be that the consulate needs some more information from you. That's kind of one part of administrative processing. Another thing it could mean is that some other security agency within the US has flagged the application and is going to kind of vet the application and do more with it. And in that case, it can be harder to get information about when the administrative processing will end because the consulate really can't move the case forward until they hear back from that agency clearing the case to continue. So when you're thinking about the timeline for getting your visa, you do want to just consider that even if kind of the E-2 is approved, you also need to be thinking about am I going to be put into administrative processing? And this is more likely if there's any issues such as any prior criminal convictions, if there's any travel to any countries with which the U.S. has kind of known security issues. These are all things that could increase the likelihood of administrative processing. So more USCIS filings. So we saw this spike a lot during the pandemic when people were unable to travel, but were in the US. Then often they would apply with USCIS. Another kind of benefit to a USCIS filing that we didn't go over previously is timing, in the sense that when you file your petition, you can pay the government an additional $2,805 to get a response within 15 business days. That can be an approval, a denial, or request for more evidence. So sometimes people prefer that certainty of knowing they're going to get an answer within a certain amount of time, as opposed to if you go to a consulate, there is no ability to kind of pay for expedited processing. You can, you'll submit your application. Most consulates will then have a review period. The review period can be weeks. The review period can also be months. For some consulates still kind of recovering from the pandemic, maybe even, close to a year, although that is much more rare. And when you have that longer wait at the consulate, there's often very little you can do to speed that up. Although once you get invited to schedule your interview, you can submit an expedite request. Again, though, if it's not a truly urgent situation or a true emergency, they may not be willing to grant the expedite request. All right, so we have reached the end of the presentation. And now if there are any questions that have come on, we'll take those. All right, so it doesn't look like we have any questions. So I'll close here. Thank you everyone for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.